Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan, a warm welcome to Muslima Insight. Today in Muslima Insight, we're going to take a look at a topic that lies very close to the hearts and the lives of people across the world, but especially also in South Africa, and that is the topic of child as well as teen sexual abuse. And with me in studio to share with us their insight and knowledge and experience on this very pertinent and very sensitive topic, we've got the lovely Shayda Umar from the Teddy Bear Clinic. She holds a master's degree in mental health, as well as a PhD in child sexual abuse, as well as a diploma in marital counseling, and also forensic assessment of child victims of abuse. Assalamu alaikum, Shayda, and a warm welcome.
Wa alaikum salam, and shukran for having me on your show. Thank you.
And then we also have a regular face and a regular guest right here on ITV. He is a clinical psychologist, educationist, researcher and development specialist from Shape to Learner. Warm welcome and assalamu alaikum, Gerald Williamson.
Wa alaikum salam. Thanks for having us.
Thank you both for being here. In starting this topic that is so sensitive, because it pertains to our children, and we all are obviously protective, I think it is. And although we have an idea what sexual abuse is, for the sake of our viewers, and especially our parents, our adolescents, I'm going to start at the very basic question: what is child sexual abuse?
Well, I think child sexual abuse is actually a very broad definition. It could be both contact and non-contact. It could be an adult violating a child sexually. It could be a child violating another child. Previously, the World Health Organization focused on adult on child, any form of sexual contact, but as I've mentioned, it could be non-contact abuse as well. It's not always the fondling, the kissing, the touching, the masturbation, the oral sex. It goes sometimes beyond that, where filming a child, grooming a child. When I speak about filming, it could be the pornographic images, the sexual images taken of a child unbeknown to the child. Even voyeurism, peeping through a keyhole or watching a child undress when the child is actually unaware that the adult or the adolescent may be using this for their own purposes of sexual gratification. So as you can see, it is quite broad. I mentioned grooming, which was not a criminal offense in the past, is now a criminal offense according to the Sexual Offences Act. And grooming is actually preparing the child, violating the boundaries without the child actually understanding or being aware that he or she is being prepared for sexual abuse.
Thank you. And Gerald, from your side?
I think to add on what Shahida has said, there's a big area of focus that is obviously under scrutiny and debate worldwide, is whether children can abuse another child. So obviously, looking at age-related matters, for example, we are finding that there's often big community uproar when 6 and 7-year-olds are involved in sexual activities with each other. And of course, the idea that it's a debate, it's around sexual responsibility, emotional maturity and awareness for that matter, and whether children are aware they are sometimes violating the rights of the other sexually, or are they necessarily imitating a society and role modeling it, watching movies where people kiss and fondle each other, etc. These days, in a westernized context, for example, we often see these afternoon soapies, and it is not unnatural, if I put it in inverted commas, to have parents have these soapies on while kids are at home, and you see half-naked people in there. Absolutely. And whether a 6 or 7-year-old or 5-year-old who actually watches this, or 8-year-old, sees this as a natural act, and they emulate it. And of course, often with dire consequences, and as a society we react to that.
So it is the physical, as well as what Shayda has alluded to, it is almost that invasion of the privacy of a child, because the child is innocent and the child doesn't have the acumen and the knowledge yet that what this person is doing is in actually invading my space and my privacy pertaining to my own sexuality, etc. Gerald, you also mentioned about the activities. When would you consider an activity between two children as sexual abuse? I mean, children, when they are small, they go through the phase of exploring their bodies, playing doctor, that type of thing. But when do they overstep that line, when it becomes sexual abuse?
You know, when I mention the word debate, I'm saying at the human behaviorist level, you know, part of the definitions around what constitutes offending touch and violating touch, bullying / abuse sexually, etc., often would potentially differ, because we need to look at this in a global perspective. We mustn't talk as if our culture is a dominant culture, you know, per se. So images of sexual imagery differs from culture to culture. And so often when we, therefore, in a certain cultural context, demand a set of social mores, standards, we often would call that the violation of the other if those mores are crossed, right? So I would argue very strongly, though, you know, that it would be logical to assume when the other doesn't necessarily take part in that social mores, crosses it and violates the other psychologically, or it crosses standards of decency. You know, one would then say there's the potential for psychological harm that could emanate from this act, to date or for future date.
And from you, Shada?
I think just to add on what Gerald said, one needs to look at the pattern of behavior, the frequency, the severity, and the intensity. So when does normal constitute abnormal? You know, as you highlighted, going beyond developmental curiosity and beyond the social experimentation, which falls within the realm of normal behavior. So coming back to pattern, where children, we find that objectify or sexualize every opportunity or interaction or engagement in their daily behavior, that would be a red flag. Then frequency, where the behavior becomes repetitive. You know, there's a compulsivity to engage in sexual activity with another child. The intensity, we're looking at the severity, where it becomes progressively more severe and invasive. And then again, if we look, so we talked about pattern, and then we talk about duration, where initially the alleged perpetrator, the initiator, I would like to use the word initiator, would reach out for 30 seconds, start off by touching maybe the genitalia for 30 seconds and, you know, retract. And then the next time would extend that duration, so extending that period of sexual contact or sexual reach out. So again, if we look at those indicators, that would clearly translate into abnormality, and that would constitute sexual abuse. I think what one needs to also understand, and Gerald highlighted that we're talking about young children, children as young as 6, 7, and even 5 years old. We've done some comprehensive research where 5-year-olds have conducted this kind of behavior behind closed doors. What does that indicate? That the whole dynamic of abuse underlies secrecy. And these children are often aware that it is not acceptable behavior, and they orchestrate this behavior behind closed doors for fear of getting caught. But they also, their modus operandi is sometimes focusing on coercion, you know, using intimidation, threats, and even being quite manipulative, you know, tricking their peer or the victim, the alleged victim, in cooperating or enlisting the support by providing social reinforcers like tokens, sweets, toys, or any other kind of rewards. So one can see that if there's any display of that kind of behavior, that constitutes sexual abuse.
Sure. So, and it's actually shocking to learn that it is children at that age. And again, one can look at the media and ask, how much exposure do these kids get that is not for them. Coming to another question is, how common is sexual abuse among children of different ages? What is the ratio? What are we looking at?
I think it's more common than we are actually aware of. The statistics that are available are not an accurate reflection because a lot of it goes unreported. There's underreporting, and sometimes I think a lot of children get away with it. So any statistics that we have would not be an accurate reflection, but we find that a lot of our referrals are children who are sexually abusing other children. Daily at the clinic, a lot of referrals come from educational institutions. We are even getting referrals from ECD centers. Now, these are very young children who are sexually aggressive, where they're using blunted objects to insert into the genitalia of other children.
Very shocking.
I think, so just in response to your question around statistics, it is a common phenomena, but I think also in response to what Gerald said, that behavior is learnt. It becomes a socially conditioned response, and children become desensitized to what they are exposed to.
Sure. I think, we are, when we talk about a more westernized concept, right, or Euro-westernized concept, as in South Africa and its neighboring countries, urbanized ones. So, what is becoming very clear is that we know that there's something called the age of responsibility, largely speaking. At which stage does emotional maturity really become indicative of a crime being committed knowingly and consciously? So many child theorists argue that, for example, up to the age of 9 years old, that there's no clear full frontal lobe activation, implying that that's where your emotions really reside and you are able to start having insight into that. From that point onward, it's really how long is a piece of string, because it depends on a child's influence, how they actually get exposed to education, etc., on really gaining very much advanced insight into their what they are doing.
Gerald, unfortunately, I have to come in there. We have to go to an ad break. Stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A warm welcome back to Muslima Insight. Today in Muslima Insight, we are taking a closer look at child as well as teen sexual abuse. Shada, before the break, Gerald was expounding for us about some of the conditioning and what children, how they develop, what is prevalent and what isn't. Coming back to the question of how common is sexual abuse among children of different ages, is there any stats available on that?
Indeed, comprehensive research has been done, and more than 42% of sexual assaults are committed by children against other children. I think the Pretoria newspaper also reported that nationally 88 rapes are committed by children on other children. Sure. So it's not sensationalizing anything, but this is just to paint a true picture to what is actually happening out there.
I think one has to cross-reference this with some of the social trends that we have been noticing, and that is the increasing breakdown of the family unit and the increasing stress that the family unit and parental figures are finding themselves under, especially in a context of economic survival. And there's often in other parts of the world, there's a correlation between certain forms of crime and economic strife or difficulty. So it wouldn't be therefore unrealistic to make the assumption that as parents are becoming more and more involved in the game of life, the survival game, economic, working, long hours, and so forth, that children are starting to struggle and suffer under this. And then, of course, to be blunt about it, where television has often become the child minder in homes. And it's an unregulated activity, and there's no control over what images flows into our kids. And it's also safe to say, therefore, that they will start emulating and role modeling at one level.
Absolutely.
They will start experimenting. There's a lot of curiosity elements, and then even cross into that realm of crime, committing a crime, simply because such behavior becomes normalized in the absence of any parental values.
Would you say children are psychologically ready when they start experimenting? Are they developed enough to understand really what they are busy doing?
You're talking about the child as a perpetrator.
The child as a perpetrator that gets exposure to all these type of images on TV. Let's say it is a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. Are they ready? Do they know what they are busy watching?
And earlier on I mentioned how long is a piece of string, right? And we spoke about age-related conduct and whether some kids have more insight than others. And I said some of the variables involved in trying to analyze this, one is to consider, for example, age of exposure, duration of exposure, intensity of exposure, parental value involvement, etc. But it would be hard to generalize and say all kids do know what they are doing, etc., without taking concern of some of those variables.
I'd like to just add to what Gerald is saying, is that often we find that a lot of these children that are manifesting this kind of behavior actually have a history of victimization. When I say history of victimization, it's not always a history of sexual abuse per se, but a history of physical abuse. A significant number of children that have presented at our clinic have had a history of being physically assaulted and abused by their significant others. Some of them have had a history of sexual abuse, but we also find that the family where there's been an absence of paternal presence, you know, the lack of an adequate adult male role model in their lives, somebody to identify with. Also children who have had exposure to violence, so domestic violence, neighborhood violence, a culture of violence, because violence begets violence. And as Gerald so rightfully explained, that children instill this, you know, it's assimilated into their behavioral repertoire because what they've been exposed to. But often in terms of the media playing the role of surrogate parent, we find that children are observing, are trying to process the information they've been exposed to, and often have lots of questions and are not able to provide answers to those questions, or do not have someone that they can speak to or dialogue with regarding their questions. And what does it result in? Confusion. And when there's a lot of confusion for younger children, that would translate into trauma, leaving the child feeling quite powerless, helpless, hopeless, and out of control. And often it's an attempted solution to that situation, where children would then resort to maladaptive behavioral patterns, you know, that's their way of solving the problem.
And processing that what they've they've seen.
And I think it's such a thin line also between sexual transgression and bullying behavior with a sexual element involved. You know, earlier on Shahida mentioned about kids using violence to actually superimpose power and control over another, but often using the sexual imagery as part of the whole exercise. And that need to be considered as part of the breakdown of the family unit in a broader society. Because, you know, often it is argued about older sexual offenders that it does come down to pure power and control, you know, and using sexuality as a means of control is one of the crudest and most brutal forms of control that you can exercise over another, whether you use it stealthily, manipulatively, or even overtly in a very aggressive way. And what often happens under these conditions, it implies that when in the family home, for example, when kids watch the exercise of power and control, and they are being groomed and socialized into exercising power and control over others, they do become little bullies and so forth. And by saying also that there seems to have been a history of this type of maladaptive behavior underscores the point, you know, that the family home these days is under severe stress, and when children start acting out in this way, in such a bad way, we are then having to revisit what we want from our homes and what we really want for our kids. But it is becoming a crisis, and the free flow of television and the media and other forms of media is just becoming crazy.
Absolutely.
I think there's an element of grandiosity attached to sexuality. It's also overrated, you know, via the media, and often children identify with this because of the eroticization, and they see celebrity figures, icons, authority figures, and everywhere they turn to, I mean, if we look around from your adverts to billboards, everything is about sexuality and the grandiosity. So often children resort to this kind of behavior when they feel threatened or anxious. They resort to things that sits on their foreground.
And it's in their face. I mean, it's in us, our faces as adults, and we don't realize the child is in the car, the child is also exposed.
And it's so hard as a parent when you innocently saying, let's watch this little drama. And even in the most innocent of dramas, and I have a parental response in which I say, not again. I have to apply my own censorship, and I switch it off and I said, let's wait 30 seconds. I know it's an interesting scene, but we'll switch on now again, and then we switch on.
Yes,
but the
it's
fact,
worth it.
yeah,
It's worth
the fact of the matter is, this whole glamorization of sexuality and nudity, the chickens are coming home to roost more and more. You know, and it has come home to roost a long time ago. And as unless parents now decide that there's some form of intervention required, if we're going to let this go as the new normal, I think what we are starting to see is the breakdown of the lower level of our society, where kids were supposed to be protected at some level.
Absolutely.
We are now starting to see that the violence is now going right down to the bottom. And I will not lie to you when I say, you know, when you watch TV or you open up a magazine in a doctor's office, you know, you walk into a waiting room and the magazine's lying on there. It's got a lot of half-naked people, and you're sitting there with your little child and you're saying, but I wonder what the long-term impact of this is going to be on this young boy or girl as an adult, you know.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to shield them against the impact. You can try to constantly say, but this is not right. You know, this shouldn't be like that. It cheapens this, and it does it. And that's what parents can do to intervene already, you know, to start talking about it and not let it go.
And not let it go, absolutely. Shada?
I think Gerald's raised such a pertinent and critical issue. The challenge lies with interaction between parents and children, the dialoguing. Gerald said he has a strategy at his home on how to deal with the situation. And I know I've often spoken to parents and caregivers, and the way they manage the situation, they just flit from channel to channel. They just change it, leave it hanging for the child to process and make sense of it, you know, and it's not addressed. In actual fact, the way to address it is to say, I'm actually embarrassed at what we've just seen, or I feel awkward about it. What do you think about it? Even if it's a 5-year-old, to actually engage the child in dialogue, to say, this is acceptable, that is not acceptable, talk about appropriate and inappropriate. So again, informing the child, because we know information is, you know, it liberates the child, and it gives a sense of power to the child, but also makes the child aware of choices. It's about pro-social skills, developing pro-social skills and making positive choices.
It's absolutely true that children, you know, we always say knowledge is power, and that's why we need to empower the child with the correct information and create that opportunity to talk about what is correct, what is acceptable and what not. On that note, it is time for us to take a short break. Stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A warm welcome back to Muslima Insight. Before the break, we were discussing the great impact that parenting has when it comes to child abuse, and the topic that we are addressing, and something very pertinent that you have mentioned is that many of the perpetrators are or were bullied themselves. There was violence in the house, a lack of being in control of their own bodies or their own lives, and they tend to then want to be in control. And that is when abuse many times happens. So again and again it is emphasized, what are we doing as parents, and the important role that we play. When it comes to that, and Gerald, you had and you also confirmed that I gave a very good example what parents can do. And we need to, I feel it's very important that these very practical things is what parents need to start take cognizance of. Switch the TV off for a period of time when there is a scene that is inappropriate. What kind of comments would be age appropriate that you can tell your child, you sit comfortably, you watch a sitcom and something unexpected comes on, you off the TV. What conversation should then take place in age appropriate context?
Well, I think again, first as the adults, one needs to acknowledge one's own feelings, to say, I'm feeling embarrassed, I'm feeling awkward about this, I'm not feeling okay. Depending on the age of the child, you're going to use language that would be age appropriate for the child, to say, Mommy's not feeling okay, or Daddy's not feeling okay, it's actually not right.
Mm-hmm.
So again, to say to the child, when you saw that, and explain to the child that that is not, that is not what we do,
mm-hmm.
or it's not the right thing for us to do. Mm-hmm. But one needs to hear from the child, mm-hmm. how the child felt, or what questions does the child have, or what comments does the child have. Give the child a platform, because by providing that opportunity, one is encouraging and giving permission to the child, so that in future, if he or she has any questions or issues, they would feel comfortable to come forward, mm-hmm. and articulate that, mm-hmm. and they wouldn't resort to turning to books, to YouTube and TV, social media, their peers, because often we find that they resort to distorted or distortions, mm-hmm. of sex and sexuality. Mm-hmm. So that would be a good way to start the process.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I think at another level, I would advise people, parents, uncles, aunts, to also be able to talk about what's happening around us. Mm-hmm. To say, you can make a remark to say, are they trying to sell a car again with a naked woman next to it? What do you mm-hmm. think of that? Mm-hmm. Is that smart? Mm-hmm. Or what?
Is it respectful?
Yeah, what are they trying to do?
Mm-hmm.
And tell me, how do you think your mom must feel to watch a naked woman standing there, because she's a woman also,
mm-hmm.
mm-hmm. and so forth. And how much your sisters feel,
mm-hmm.
and so forth. So by articulating and bringing up, especially with a boy child, mm-hmm. right, it is very important that we make them understand that what's happening around them doesn't necessarily reflect reality per se. Mm-hmm. Like for example, when a group of guys or whatever in a scene just walks into a pub and whatever they have in these movies, and you see picks up a girl and leaves with them, and say, son, whenever you're going to be that age, it will never be that simple. Mm-hmm. You will have to court a person, you will have to respectfully get a number, you will have to go through this whole ritual, mm-hmm. but don't think you're going to disrespect somebody by picking them up in a mm-hmm. space or a room like that, and the next minute we see a bedroom scene. Mm-hmm. That is unrealistic. Mm-hmm. And you start talking to your teenagers about mm-hmm. that, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have this pressure that boys and girls go through around teenage sexuality, that it should be like in the movies,
Exactly.
We should just do it so easily with each other. Mm-hmm. And I think it brings me to the idea of teen sexuality especially. It's a very complex phase. And when we talk about teen sexual abuse, mm-hmm. how teenagers misdirect this message, misunderstands it, mm-hmm. Become demanding about sexual attention and advances. There's no space for negotiation. Therefore, let's negotiate our feelings first. And it might take you, like in the old days, years or months or whatever to first win the affection of somebody. Mm-hmm. No, this fast forward culture, because in a 30-minute movie, mm-hmm. it went from A to Z so quickly. And you have these teenage boys and girls thinking that when they meet each other now, a day or two later, they're engaging in sexual acts. Mm-hmm. And it's not reality. But this raising of an instant emotional culture, quick gratification, it's taking too long that we're still talking to each other and courting each other. Without parental advice, discussion, this becomes a very dangerous period and often results in a lot of sexual abuse from one teenager to another.
Yes. So there's an absolute role that parents need to stand up to and say, when and how do I educate my child appropriately in life about sex and sexuality, but also I think what is important is the emotional content of a relationship with another person, the responsibility in that, the whole context with regards to morality, being in a relationship, in preferably obviously what we would say as Muslims in your marriage, that is the appropriate time to engage. Coming to another question is, are there any particular children that are more at risk for sexual abuse?
Indeed, Adila, I think it's important to understand, we know firstly that children are the most marginalized population group, so they are more vulnerable. Secondly, children with disabilities. Children with disabilities are at greater risk of being violated simply due to the fact that they do not always have the capacity to make a full disclosure or even make a disclosure. We find children with hearing deficits, speech deficits, physical disabilities, children with cerebral palsy. So in general, children with disabilities are at a huge risk of being sexually abused. And we find that predators will seek out these children simply due to the fact that they cannot disclose or will not disclose, or that their disclosure will be viewed with caution because they do not have the capacity to make a clear and detailed disclosure or give a clear account of what has happened.
And in the general mainstream, if we now talk about children that are not disabled, are there specific personality types, children that perhaps are more shy, that type of thing?
Yes, indeed. I think, again, children that have low self-esteem, that come from a culture of violence, domestic violence, where they've been subjected to abuse themselves, both directly and indirectly, even emotional abuse, we're going to find that those children are more likely to be abused, but also children who have been subjected to maybe a once-off incident of sexual abuse are more likely to find themselves or gravitate to a situation where they are going to be re-abused, because in their mind they rationalize, they justify that they're going to find themselves in a setting where they will be able to protect themselves. They will not be abused again. In actual fact, that doesn't happen. But just in terms of identifying the possibilities of or the specific population group of children that are at greater risk, it would fall under those categories of children.
Coming to the psychological profile of a person that abuses, I mean, we're talking about teens in their adolescence. What would cause a teenager, for example, to go and abuse a person that is disabled? I mean, obviously, what is lacking in that adolescent, in their upbringing? What has gone wrong? What is not there that causes him to go over that line?
I think we need to look at unmet emotional needs. It's often trying to fill that hole in the heart. Our experiences in clinical practice has indicated that behind that bad child or mad child, there's usually a very sad child. And as I've highlighted previously, that child, that adolescent, is suffering from low self-esteem, feelings of low self-worth, feeling unworthy. And if that child has been violated in any way, there may be this typical damaged goods syndrome that I'm not worthy of any love, and sometimes just being subjected to a lot of shame and humiliation, labeling, so living out this script of being no good. But there could be many other contributing factors that would give impetus to this child to act out. As you've mentioned, the child may be a victim of bullying, or the child may have been exposed to sexually explicit scenes or behavior, or having been a subject of abuse. So there are many factors that would contribute to that kind of behavior, which we've discussed earlier on about younger children as well. Poverty, I think, is also an important factor. We do not say that there's a linear causal effect between poverty and sexual abuse, but poverty does create conditions under which sexual abuse flourishes. Children living in overcrowded situations, witnessing repeated sexual behavior. We know that many children live in a home where there are 10 or 12 people living in a single room.
Sure.
So I think those are also factors that one need to consider.
Absolutely. On that note, it is time for us once again to go to an ad break. Don't go away. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A warm welcome back to Muslima Insight. Today we are talking about child sexual abuse as well as teen sexual abuse. I would like to know what would be the psychological impact that on a victim when a child is sexually abused, as well as when a teen is sexually abused. What happens to their development educationally, emotionally, etc.?
It's a great question. I think, often in the case with any form of trauma, and because there's an interpretive effect, if once the person assesses what has happened to them and they interpret it and they perceive it to be a traumatic event, you have the typical post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder type of reaction, and especially in later years, when the adult mind becomes more mature and it reflects on the experience, we tend to see different responses. As in the case was with Bob Hewitt. I don't know if you've been following the case where as a tennis coach he was abusing those girls, and we see them now as adults and we see them think back, but we also see them taking more control. And so the impact, while it's been traumatic over many years, at this stage of their lives, as 40-year-olds, they were able now to take control of that message, what has happened to them, and rework it. But as they were saying, earlier in the years, and this is just typical examples, earlier in the years, the feelings of humiliation, guilt that they may have caused it, shame, embarrassment, and often increasing lowered self-esteem, and then often learning problems emanating from that also. High stress responses, hyper reactive to problematic scenarios, aggression, latent aggression, meaning some people might react by not necessarily fighting with others but withdrawing as a form of aggression. They don't necessarily want to engage in conflict. Often these are symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder, which is a huge disorder by itself, because it really ruins so many parts of your life.
Absolutely. And Jada, your experience, are there any specific other symptoms that you can relate?
Okay, I think if we're looking at, you asked specifically about younger children and then looking at adolescents. With younger children, often I think the signs and symptoms are, we would find that there's recurrent nightmares, loss of bowel and bladder control, a drastic change in their personality. A child that was previously very quiet and withdrawn may suddenly become outwardly robust, aggressive, or a child that was more extrovertish suddenly becomes very withdrawn, and also sleeping disorders, poor performance at school. Suddenly the grades plummet. But I think, and one needs to also be careful about that, because some children will excel and sublimate where they start taking control by performing very well at school. So those are the children that would go unnoticed. Also the eating disorders, again, because food is a primary nurturer. So the child can take control by what I put into my mouth and what I release. So, you know, the purging, the bulimics, the anorexia nervosa, that's very common in your adolescence as well. And again, being very aggressive, your typical bullying child. It's also a way and form of taking back the sense of power and control in one's life. So those are typical manifestations of younger children. But if we focus on the adolescent, we find that there's your self-defeating, self-destructive behavioral patterns. So again, a 13, 15-year-old would show or demonstrate signs of promiscuity. How often don't we hear from educators where they make reference to male educators saying that the girl learner has come onto them, or, you know, trying to seduce the male adult educator. But also the substance abuse, alcohol and drugs. Again, it's about self-destroying, self-destruction. So these are also, and I mentioned already, the eating disorders and a lack of interest in daily activities which they previously enjoyed. So things like watching television or reading or outdoor activities or engaging with other people, suddenly the child withdraws. And depression, where they, you know, weep easily, and the loss of interest, you know, it's again internalizing that aggression. With females, we find that they tend or likely to internalize it. With your male adolescents, they likely tend to externalize it. So I think those are common manifestations that one sees. But something that one also needs to take note of is, in the case of sexual abuse, with our female adolescents, one would notice that some young girls tend to wear layers of clothing. Now, why layers of clothing? It's sometimes to shield themselves from the perpetrator. It's, you know, a deterrent or to delay the process, but it's also to cover up the shame, the guilt, the humiliation, the embarrassment, because in their minds they believe everybody can see what has happened to them. So even on this hot, sweltering day, that young female adolescent is likely to wear layers of clothing. And also another thing, we talk about self-destruction, the self-mutilation, the self-cutting. And in our experiences, we find often they would cut in areas where it's not easily visible to the naked eye, the inner thighs, the upper arms, and areas which are not easily visible.
Sure.
You know, if you listen to this whole conversation, you start getting the impression that our kids live in complex times, you know, and I don't want to run the risk of over-pathologizing human nature, because sexuality, it's part of, and sexual development is part of human nature. And I think we should make it clear to people watching that it's about when the normal goes wrong, right? What should be seen as normal goes wrong, when it's distorted, when it's influenced by layers and layers of other stuff that distorts the so-called, in inverted commas, normal growth of a young person. And I mean, as Shaida was speaking, I was even thinking about when she was speaking about layers, I've seen the opposite side, and I think she has experienced it too. That is when young adolescents over-sexualize, even through their body imagery, when they literally start wearing less and less. And often for girl children that are very mature physically in years, it becomes such a dangerous cycle, because the more reinforcement they get from male or other partners, they actually start enjoying the attention. But it sets the scene for vulnerability, because that's when the adult predators tend to zoom in, and because often these young adolescents don't always understand that by creating an environment fertile for that draws the attention of pedophiles, etc., by over-sexualizing your behavior, going on to, let's say, electronic media, putting up pictures half naked of yourself and stuff like that, you do invite the wrong people into your space, and it becomes more higher risk. But at the end, the message should be that nobody should violate anyone at any cost, anyhow.
Absolutely.
You know, it doesn't matter if somebody put a picture of themselves half naked on there. The rule and the law and the morality of it all is that you have no right to violate another human being, whether you are of any age. The younger you are, of course, the more we'd like to say, well, we the adults take part responsibility, because we need to guide you through these phases and these icebergs. Later in life, when you become a young adolescent, young adult, we therefore say you become the subject of what has happened before, largely, and what conditions you are now creating to have those messages invited into your life. But still, nobody can be blamed, not for rape, not for any form of sexual abuse. It is about that power and control that that perpetrator wants to exert over the other, and they should be the ones to be punished.
Absolutely. And coming to prevention, is there more that institutions can do, that we can ask government to do, so that we can start to stop this growing epidemic that we have in our societies?
Absolutely. This requires a collaborative, intersectoral approach. Firstly, you mentioned government. I think it goes beyond government. Yes, government has a huge responsibility and role to play, but we mustn't shift responsibility from the
only
family.
on the government.
So, you know, parents, family, neighborhood, the whole environment, departments of education, department of health, department of labor, you know, all the relevant departments actually have to sit together and synchronize and work in synergy, because as we speak, legislation and policy are actually in contradiction. You know, there's discrepancies around issues. If we talk about ages of consent, the age of consent to have sex is 16, yet the age of consent to have a termination of pregnancy in theory is 12 years old, but any age a child would qualify for a termination of pregnancy. And then if we're looking at surgical procedures or intervention, the age of consent is 18. So should a termination of pregnancy go awry, or if there's any challenges, the child would then require the consent of the legal guardian. But for a termination of pregnancy, there's no legal guardian consent required. So what I'm saying is that we all have a role and responsibility to play. Firstly, that we need to create more awareness. There needs to be prevention programs, early intervention, and of course intervention. But the prevention programs, parents need to engage in more dialogue, and of course we need everybody to come to the party. Child protection should be everybody's business. It's not my business or your business, everybody's business.
I concur. Thank you for that. I think I agree.
Once again, we have come to the end of today's program, and I thank my guests for being here with us and sharing all these ideas and the knowledge that you have that is so vital for all of us, especially the parents that are raising kids in this country. And of course, may we all take heed of examples that we have from our own deen, from our own religion, our own Prophet Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that in his years of growing up as a young man, right up till the age of 25, he was celibate. He did not engage in any sexual activity before he actually got married at that age. And perhaps that's another thought that I would like to leave our viewers with. Is that not what we should be promoting and teaching our children? The sacredcy, the beauty of intimacy at the right time when it is within the context of marriage. From myself, Adila, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.